Join us today as we reflect on some of the elephants in the room, like COVID-19. Now, it's a subject all of us have beaten the dead horse on, but we're just going to take a little while today and reflect on the past year, look at the political climate in our country, other events that have happened, and talk about our own experience, how they've been similar and different, and how they have impacted the local church. So join us today on the Happy Holy Hour. Welcome to the Happy Holy Hour, a podcast where everyday Christians grow in their faith through biblical examination and insightful discussion. I'm glad you're here today. If you enjoy the content you're about to hear, make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and visit us at thehappyholyhour.org. Let's get started. I'm Tyler, and I'm here with Travis today. Travis, we're going to be taking the roles of a couple of old men sitting on the front porch, reflecting on our past while possibly bickering over our petty disagreements.
That doesn't sound too bad.
No, it doesn't.
Like if that's my future.
Well,
I told my wife, that's like if I had to, we'll see what God has in stores, but older age would be lots of land and a wraparound porch with a rocking chair on it so I can sit on it and watch the sunset.
Honestly, I'd be with you. We'd be best friends in retirement, but I don't think we'll be bickering too much today. But I thought it'd be fun to try to take some time and reflect just on the past year and a half, 2 years. Honestly, this whole COVID situation has been around as pretty much as long as this podcast, right? I mean, and we sit here at about 89, 90 episodes, and this whole time, there has been this COVID pandemic and all of the turmoil in politics over the past couple of years. But it's impacted us both differently in our personal lives and also our experiences in the local church. There's been a lot of transformation that's gone on since then. So we're in the fall of 2021. Right, we're 89 episodes in on this podcast.
COVID you better clarify that because things move so fast.
I know, right? This episode, I believe, releases in October of 2021.
Yeah, by the time this comes out, all of the stuff we talked about would not be relevant, and we'll be on to this new stage.
Oh, that's scary. But Travis, over the last 2 years, what's been your personal experience just with this COVID pandemic and thinking about our relationship with the church? Give me some insight. What have you been going through?
Yeah, it's hard to think back. It seems, I guess it has been a long time ago, when it first started, and there were so many stages in that as restrictions came and went and life just changed. But when it first came out, and for context, I work at a Christian camp and conference center. So the kind of, I don't know how you would say it because I know we're in the nonprofit sector with that, but the hosting market and entertainment market, all of that got hit really hard. And so our ministry got really hit hard with that. We weren't sure, a lot of other camps closed permanently. And so it was kind of what's going to happen here? So, so that was going on. I had to work from home a little bit. And my wife is an RN and she works at a long-term care, rehab, assisted living, kind of a souped up nursing home kind of place. So she saw the brunt of that in the medical field. So we actually were dealing with two of the opposite spectrums, right? You had some who were really being directly affected by the sickness. And then you had others who were really more directly affected by the regulations, restrictions, mandates that were being passed down, and weren't necessarily being directly affected by the sickness. So we saw both sides of that, which was really helpful for us because it kind of gave us a balanced perspective. My wife's dealing with people dying and breaking it to families whose loved ones were dying and seeing it sweep through their facility and all of this kind of stuff. And so there's that reality. And at the same time, I'm dealing with families who their kids are really they really were affected pretty hard with the restrictions and mandates and having to be at home and not socialize and not get out and not be kids and have parents who are still working their jobs and yet they had to now figure out childcare, or people who lost their job. Like, so I really saw that side of things, where, Bonnie was more with the people who were really directly affected with the sickness. So that helped us give a balanced perspective. I think we still agree, like, between me and her on things for the most part. So, but it helped me to be compassionate, and not to, because for me, working with families, it was easy for me to be like, what are you doing? Don't you see how this is affecting, like, the families and all of that? And so that helped me, and vice versa. So, I personally haven't gotten COVID yet. I've had family gotten COVID, had close ones, or acquaintances pass away and things like that, but haven't directly in our immediate family been affected by it. And we didn't lose our jobs. We weren't laid off or anything like that.
Yeah, praise God.
And it's, like I said, my wife's vaccinated. I'm not vaccinated. And so, like, we have, their differences there. So, we've had a pretty balanced approach to the whole thing.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There was a lot, and that's just a really brief summary, because so many things. It's been like 2 years now, almost 2 years now. So a lot's happened in between there, and it's fluctuated. And thankfully, like, we were able to run summer camps one year, but just barely. Like, we had to cut our capacity in half. So we lost a lot of ministry opportunities there. We saw a lot of hurt. Again, children were indirectly really affected by some of the decisions that were made, and whether or not the decisions were right or wrong, I just know they were directly affected. And
they're tough.
Yeah. So it's been tough to wade through that, but and then the other thing that happened is we're in between churches when all this was going on. So trying to find a new church was really difficult when every different church, some churches weren't even open, which, was kind of frustrating, but we'll get to that topic. And then, everybody had their own, like, different policies. Certain churches you had to sign up in advance. And so we didn't know that. And we get there and they'd be like, oh, you're not on the list. And I'm like, well, this is awkward, that kind of thing. Like, thankfully the Lord led us through that, and we ended up finding a church and all that. But it was just there were a lot of other difficult things going on. It was just such a weird time, and COVID just complicated all of that. And I think everybody could feel that. So,
dude, it was such a weird time. I remember, like, so when the mandates went down, that, like, in Pennsylvania, this was just a hot mess in and of itself, that all non-essential workers, whatever, like, you can't go to work. So I worked from home for like 3 months, from like March till June. And then I went to work in the summertime. I got COVID in November of 2020. My dad actually contracted it from a coworker. Then my dad was sent home, but then my dad gave it to my whole family. I don't know if he feels bad about that,
Dad.
but literally everybody in my dad's department and all of their families got COVID. So it was like close to a 100% infection rate just within that little bubble. But it was just nuts. I was really sick for like 9 to 10 days. I had issues with lung pain and chest pain. Didn't really fully, I guess if you can say, fully recover for like 9 months. Because even now I still occasionally deal with like chest pain that started with COVID. The typical lost my sense of taste and smell for like 2 months. But it came back. But it was funny, after my quarantine ended, people still didn't want to get close to me for a while. Yeah.
Isn't that's so weird. That's like a whole nother topic. Like the whole, like, like you whisper the word, or if you had it in the past, you don't want to tell people because people treat you different. Even if it was like a year ago, it's so weird.
It's like leprosy.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. But like at the same time that I had it, my mom had it, and she has like bronchial issues to begin with, but she has this lifesaver inhaler that basically, if something happens and she can't breathe, she takes it, it opens up her airways, and basically it goes back to normal. But so it was really bad for her, and she went to take it and actually made it even worse. She had to go to the ER, and which is like also a conflicting time, right? Because at that time, ER beds are full. All that stuff was going on. But like me, she was stubborn and didn't really go to the hospital. So we kept an eye on her to make sure she didn't stop breathing. But that was in November of 2020. So we're almost sitting at a year later. I still deal with occasional lung issues, and my dad has some health issues from it. But other than that, we've all fully recovered. But I've had, like you, extended family, friends that have died from it, which is tough.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is and it isn't, because it's hard, because like that happens. It already was happening in a sense, like, and I don't want to sound callous from this, but like people die all the time, and from
it's more of a hyper focus.
Yeah, and I think because like our whole society is dealing with it, it makes it even, I don't know, tougher. But it's so weird how it affects people differently. Like we've had, you know, something where it didn't spread through the workplace for us, and or I've had like people like get it, and then the spouse doesn't get it, and it never passes on, or like vice versa, the whole family gets it. It's just so sometimes unpredictable. It's so weird. Yeah, it is.
Well, and the whole like mask and vaccine thing, kind of like you know, I definitely would take a more individualist approach. Like if you want to wear one,
right, by
all means. But you know, if you want to get a vaccine, go get it.
And I always like, and maybe I'm just simplistic, I don't know, but I just look at all of this division and stuff. I'm like, I mean, why don't you just let people choose for themselves? Like, and I'd be like, and maybe that's somewhat my personality, right? I'm not like super type A, like whatever, dude.
But as far as like mandates going, and just vaccines for a second, like think about all of the diseases that have been eliminated by vaccines, including polio, tinnitus, hepatitis, rubella, measles, pneumococcal disease, etc. All of these things were prevented and eradicated by vaccines. So like I'm not anti-vaccine by any means, but I'm definitely not pro mandating them. But personally, I am vaccinated just because, well, I had travel plans and I didn't want them to get messed up.
Yeah.
And my rationale is just that, you know, for me, again, the Lord has put a number of days on my life. No vaccine or virus will change that sovereign plan. So I got the jab, knowing that God is sovereign over me. And like, I would never demand you to get it. I would never guilt you into getting it, but that was just a choice that I had made for myself. So Travis, COVID had some pretty interesting effects on our lives, as we just saw, but also the lives of local churches, right? Churches had to pivot in a lot of different ways, right? Government mandates on attendance. And I'm just going to run through some of the things that have happened, and we can just have some commentary on them as we go. But there were government mandates on attendance. There was even denominational regulation on, you know, whether or not you could sing or whatever. For just by example, right? On the more extreme level, some provinces in Canada restricted gatherings to 10 people or less, which obviously impacted the local church. And I know it was a pretty big deal when some pastors were arrested for breaking this regulation and encouraged their people to worship anyway. That was a pretty big deal, which I think we might talk about in a later episode on persecution and what that actually looks like. But that was pretty wild. But even within denominations, within the church, right? The United Methodist Church, for example, restricted the amount of people allowed at worship services, required masks, and did not allow corporate singing in worship. That's crazy. And, you know, on the flip side, some denominations had zero regulation for COVID, you know, basically like it never happened. So we saw a lot of different reactions coming from everywhere throughout this whole time. I know my church, Travis, went right online right away, which initially was great, but it got exhausting doing online services with all the effort that goes into that and not being able to have that rejuvenation of meeting in person. But then we finally started meeting again after a couple months with we met outdoors, which was great. It was such a cool time to do that. And then, it was just interesting how churches pivoted, even churches in our own community. You know, every which church went every different way, and it was wild.
Yeah, I think that's one of the main things that makes this whole situation hardest, right? Is because there's no, as like partisan as people want it to be, like everybody has approached this so differently. Like even so, like take churches, for instance, right? Yeah. You had people who, I think like Capitol Hill Baptist Church is a very interesting like study to do, right? Because they were based more on a doctrinal theological issue, right? Against online services, right? They don't believe that's biblical because it's not an actual corporate gathering, you know, and so they won't do it. So they have never done an online service through this whole COVID process. And yet they were, you know, slightly critical of John MacArthur's church, you know, so you think they would be like, you know, everything, all restrictions, right? But they were anti-John MacArthur's church for, their stance on staying, not complying with the government restrictions and staying open. And then, so you're like, oh, well, wait a minute, maybe they're more on this side. And then they actually filed a lawsuit against their city in DC, and I think won that lawsuit, or at least their legal fees. They had like they got reimbursed or whatever. So like you're like, okay, where do you land on this? So like, there's people like that who are totally out of the ball, and then there are some who fall way one way or way the other.
Sure.
And so you have all these different, it's not always clear cut. And for pastors, it's not. And even so, within denominations, you had people approaching things differently. So it's just, and then you break that even down to individual levels and families, and then how do you learning to agree to disagree, and then also learning where this is not something this is not an issue we could agree to disagree on, and we're making those calls. So it can get messy.
The nice thing about the state of Pennsylvania, at least, God's been gracious to us here, where all of the mandates that went into effect did not apply to religious institutions and organizations. So technically, all of the restrictions just did not apply to churches, although a lot of churches did take some sort of measures to some
that's
extent.
Interesting too. And I mean, and then kind of this comes out a little bit of where I kind of land with things. It's interesting that churches, and I think, for, concern of how are we going to be perceived, and either rightly or wrongly, how are we going to proceed by our community, if all these other places are closing, but we don't. And I think especially earlier on, I think there's a lot more churches now who wouldn't do that again. But earlier on, everybody was trying to figure out, and even like John MacArthur's church did close for a little bit at the start. Yeah. And then once it's like, okay, this is actually what we're dealing with, things became more clear, and then their perspectives change. So even people have changed their opinions throughout this thing as we learn more about it, or as different things have changed. Like I said, things have been in flux a little bit. So it's
you're allowed to change opinions. Whoa, that's crazy. Yeah. Anyway, Well, no matter how you look at it, right? Physical church attendance it dropped over the last year, according to Barna. Many churches turned to streamings. Right, in the USA, only 50% of active churchgoers streamed services, which is wild. And 15% of churchgoers that stream services admit to actively doing other things during the service. So there's distraction, or they might say multitasking. I would call it distraction.
Though, like with that 50%, does this take into account that not all churches had the ability to stream services? Like, so with if it's just counting churchgoers, only 50% stream services. Well, how many even had that ability to do that in the first place? So I'm wondering how well that reflects the actual situation.
Well, we had that conversation earlier in the year where we went through another Barna study that I believe that was only 4% of churches did not do any sort of streaming.
Right. Okay,
and even the people that did streamed multiple services from different churches. Right. So I think no matter what, active churchgoers definitely had the ability to stream, if not their own church, another church. Yeah.
Yeah. So the whole which is interesting, because the whole, we could just do it at home. That's a viable option. People don't even take advantage of that. I kind of disagree with that. That's
same.
Opinion. But so people didn't even do that. So, and I wonder how much of that was just a revealing of the current state of how we view church, or how much of that was a new phenomenon, where people hadn't been forced, or didn't have, maybe not even forced, didn't have the luxury of anonymously living how they really wanted to live, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And so, or how much of it was no, these were actually solid church goers who took it seriously, and now all of a sudden their opinions changed on things.
Yeah.
Or how much of it people really didn't care much to begin with, and now they can live the lifestyle they wanted to live.
I can live however I want because nobody can see me.
Also, it's really annoying. Like for me, like when we were like, because we were in between churches for a while, so we did like a lot of the churches weren't even open, and so we did have to live stream some. And like, I hated when their like comment sections were turned on, and you had like congregates like talking to each other during the service.
During the service,
like, so it's publicly flowing on the side of their like service, and they're just chatting about random stuff. I'm like, I would be so frustrated as a pastor if I'm up there live stream, like currently preaching at you. It'd be like, so can you imagine being in an actual service? Like somebody needs to do a parody video of like if virtual services, like if it was the same virtual as it was in person or something, because like you'd have like two people randomly stand up in the service, start having this conversation back and forth, and an argument.
Or you get the emojis, like heart.
Yeah. Oh my word, drives me nuts.
Well, it all goes back to this point though, where I think that during this time, although live streaming, it's cool that was an option, but ultimately at the end of the day, people were not being spiritually fed in the ways that they needed to be, right? They were missing out, being under the preaching of the word, worshiping, singing together corporately, taking part in the sacraments, taking part in fellowship of the church body. They were just not being fed in the ways that they needed to be. Now, some Christians less or more so than others, right? So some churches were only down and out for like a month, maybe, and then they were back at it. But some churches were online for, I know someone that's still online, and it's been a year and a half. So that is just detrimental, I would think, to the spirit, right?
Right. I know. Hard. And that's where, like, at the beginning, I think we were all trying to figure out what was going on and, how bad is this thing? And I try not to be, again, because people have their reasons and everything. I don't know everything that's going on in their life, but to still not be going. And that's I think is the main concerning thing for me too, is like, people are still living in this, whereas like the whole, and you see the government's kind of doing this too, like using that emergency, like this is the emergency thing as an excuse, and sometimes maybe it's legitimate, maybe it's not, but as an excuse to carry out some sort of action or live some sort of lifestyle. But when things have moved away from that, and of course now, like, you have people who say we haven't because we have this Delta variant and this research and all this kind of stuff, whatever. Not whatever, it is serious, but but you have people like still like they never stopped. There was never a reverting back to something. They just continued in this lifestyle or continued whatever.
Well, and a lot of that was due to the just polarization of political opinion, thought on this stuff. Like these, COVID is an issue that people get very charged about just because there's so many elements to it. There's the whole mask thing. There's the whole vaccine thing. There's X, Y, Z. There's so many factors that people are so easily charged up about, which led to what I believe to be almost a war between politics,
like a cultural war,
ideology, all that stuff.
Yeah, I was listening to like the briefing by Albert Mohler, which he has some good things to say, but he was talking about that, how like people want to make, like, especially politicians, the government wants to make everything like a political war, but really it's a cultural war. And I think Albert Mohler's point was deeper than that. It's a worldview war, but it's really cultural war, right? You have these different opposing cultures kind of going at it, and it's being championed as political, and of course it expresses itself in sometimes those ways, but at the root it's not just politics, it's actually different cultures. It's a very interesting point, and I think you brought that up there. I think it's true. And how do you, then the struggle is like, so how do you as your identity should be as the church, right? As a Christian first and foremost, but within that you have these different cultures, tensions going on. And I think that has been like the challenge.
Well, like now you have, right, we've gone through this where a lot of Christians throughout this time haven't been to a church. They've been streaming. They're spiritually starving in a sense. So now you have a bunch of starving, emaciated Christians that are not readily equipped to face the challenges of the world, right? So now how do you handle this? Everybody, I'm going to say a lot of this tongue in cheek, but everybody has their own opinions on COVID, masks, vaccines, and everything. But basically, everybody became a certified expert overnight due to their extensive research done on Fox News and CNN, right? And even Christians became very quick to attack one another over things they really didn't know much about, right? They were getting their information from news sources that are historically, politically biased. And now they're not filtering fact through bias. They're really not even factoring all of this stuff through their Christian worldview. It's immediately going into a political worldview. And now the challenge is, how do pastors care for their flocks? Like in a way that would...
too, I wonder, and I'm only 25 years old, so this is where maybe if I was a little older, I'd have more insight into this. But, where did people go to make these medical decisions in the past? Maybe it was the same. Maybe they went to these obviously more political news sources. But it is interesting. I don't want to put a blanket statement because I think a lot of people have tried to go as a truly medical, source as you can to make this decision. But what's interesting now is what happens when those sources become politicized. And that's, I think, then the hardest thing too. And this goes both ways, the misinformation, and that as they make it harder to get information, and again, this can go both ways, but a lot of times I think some people just come down to how do I know what's true, what's not, what's lies, and I think a lot of people, the decision they eventually made wasn't so much based on finding out truth and facts. It was done out of exasperation, or frustration one way or another. I'm just not going to get the vaccine just because I'm frustrated, or I am going to get the vaccine because I'm just tired of not knowing and not dealing with whatever, who knows? I don't really know if I should or not, but, and now it's whatever. I don't want to get tested weekly.
Or they're just looking for information that coincides with their predisposition. So I know a lot of people that really just, they vote Democrat all the way, or they just really lean liberal. So anything that the Pennsylvania governor, Tom Wolf, says they see as the highest thing in the land. But then you get people the supposed Aunt Nancy of the group that watches Tucker Carlson every night that deifies everything he says too. So you get people on both sides that are just only taking in information that they already have a predisposition to. And I think that led to a lot of different things. Specifically, when I think about the context of being in the church, this led to frustration for pastors because pastors do want to truly care and shepherd for their flocks, right? Yeah. But they also want to satisfy the desires of their sheep, that are concerned about safety, and they also want to maintain a decent standing in their community and a reputation and not violate any of those mandates passed down. But at the same time, there are things that you just can't compromise on that the Bible calls us to. So for pastors during this time, it was just a very frustrating time.
In some ways, it's almost an impossible task, right? And not just outside of this, but you can't, in anything, you can't satisfy everyone and you can't make everybody happy. But it gets, blown out of proportion when it's one issue that everybody's dealing with and everybody's impacted differently in some way. And so where maybe been a smaller portion of your congregation with a specific issue that did involve the whole congregation, now you have something that's affecting everybody and it's on everybody's mind. And so it's you're taking that little side issue that was between this quarrel between these two families or whatever out of your whole congregation, and now you have the two families is half of your congregation and half of your congregation, something like that. So I think it made it a lot harder. I'm sure on a smaller level they've already been wrestling with this, but now and now you're having to, you're right, is this something where we obey the government, or is this something where the government's crossed the line and we have to obey God rather than the government? Those types of things, so it's, I think, a lot harder. And again, things are always changing and there's always hard to find the right information, and all these, everything we're struggling with, pastors have been struggling with. On top of that, they have to listen to 100 or whatever people and all their opinions. So it is one of those things where, again, I just get curious, what would have happened if you just let people make their own decisions? I wonder, like, why do they feel pressured, like they have to decide one way or another in some ways, you know?
It's our culture, man.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think it comes down to the question, like, who is your God, right? Because a lot of it boiled down to having differing views of authority in all of this, right? Like, so there's some people that think of their local governors as being the highest law in the land. If you break their law, you're just a horrible, selfish person if you don't wear a mask or get the vaccine, you horrible murderer, right? But then there are other peoples that think their local governors are complete tyrants and they want their church to completely defy their local authorities. So like there are these two conflicting views of authority that, albeit they are extremes, but they do exist, and it is causing some tension. And they're like, even with the different views of authority, there are different levels of authority. Like in the United States, you have our local governments, state governments, federal. So there's a whole lot going on here that just, I think, as I observed the last 18 months, just, it was a boiling pot of mess.
Yeah, because like, within those levels of government, right, you had people opposing each other within the government, and you're seeing that now. I mean, it's been happening, but like right now, we just had those sweeping mandates passed down from the president, and then you have places like Florida. So the president's saying, if you don't do this, I'll fine you, and then the governor of Florida is saying, if you do this, I'll fine you. And so then people are like, okay, which one's the worst fine, kind of thing. It's so what do you do then? Like, right. And even within that, like, take that state of Florida, right? You might have, municipalities and local, like county or whatever, saying one thing, and then you have the governor saying another thing, and then you have the federal government saying another thing. And so, like, who do you listen to, And
you know what doesn't help in all of this? Over the last 18 months, for some reason, there has also been a boatload of racial and sexual divisions. And I don't want to go too far into this just because I think we can go way down a rabbit trail. Sure. But there was a lot of infighting in the church over the last couple of years about what all of this means, even conspiracy theories based around COVID, but to all the racial and gender issues that the church faced with Black Lives Matter, and then the movement with transgenderism. Like, there was so much going on there that now not only do you have this boiling pot of mess with COVID, you're adding all these other things in that are also hot plates of disaster for people that are just sucking on the tailpipe of culture. It's just, it's a hard thing.
Yeah. And I think, like, also you're seeing some of that's extremes, right? You have very vocal extremes, and then you have a lot of people in the middle who don't fall to, like, either extremes. And when I say extremes, like, you can hold points, but you see some of the violence, like the violent extremes that happen on both sides, that kind of thing. Whatever. Some people will minimize either side with that, but most people would not have taken part in either action, kind of thing, and they're not that alt-right, alt-left, all this stuff. Obviously, you have growing movements, and maybe one's more a reaction of the other. Again, we don't have time to get too deep into the weeds to analyze everything. But what I was trying to say is, like, the bulk of them are, like, what you're seeing on TV is not necessarily the bulk of everybody. Although some of the polls that are coming out were like, should we penalize or imprison those who don't get the vaccine? And you have, like, a very large percentage of the population saying, yeah, I'm okay with that. I mean, that's like, okay,
that's a little scary.
That does seem a little extreme, and that's a pretty big percentage. Now, some of those polling results, how accurate is that? All that kind of stuff. But I think what's also interesting is how these major shifts and divisions in ideology, how many have been coming up with the church just in the last year and a half. And these things we've been dealing with more than a year and a half, but how quickly it's been progressing. And all these major stories have just become, like, an everyday thing now. I'm thinking back, like, if you took one of the crazy things that's happened within the last year or 2 years,
vaccine cards,
right, yeah, something like that, or pastors being imprisoned in Canada, or like some of the other, like, these the shooting and these protests or the things that happened at the Capitol. Like there's like the list that we could that go on and on.
It's
you
absurd.
Take one of those things and, take it back 5 years. And like, that would have been the thing we talked about for the whole year, I think, and yet now it's just like, all right, what's next? Like you mentioned one of those things and you're like, oh my gosh, that was so long ago. And we're like, okay, it's not even been a year, it's because that's how many crazy things have happened. It's like, we almost get, like it becomes dull to us and we get like accustomed to it.
Yeah.
We get numb to it. I almost feel like, and I guess even like looking at myself, I get worried sometimes. I'm like, this is pretty crazy stuff that's going on. Like it should be concerning that people were jailed in our country. Like, pastors were jailed, and now a lot of them, I guess, a lot of them were released. Thankfully, later on, a lot of them filed lawsuits and won, and the government had to go, oops, you're right, my bad. So I mean,
which is good. That is good.
We should be thankful for that. And they, whether they admitted it or not, they were caught with an overreach of power and all of that, according to the governmental structures and the law of the land, the Constitution that we live by, thankfully. But just the fact that happened, and now it's like, areas, you look at the stuff that's still happening in Australia or other places, and it's like, whoa, that's just pretty crazy. And yet it doesn't feel crazy anymore because we're just getting used to crazy.
Yeah, and it's hard too, because like we just mentioned, the church is already starving, right? Not that the church is in danger, because Christ will preserve his church, but the people in the church, because they're not with the body every week, and all, they're not surrounded by all the benefits that come with meeting together as a fellowship, as a body of believers. Again, like, Christians were physically isolated. A lot of them are angry. A lot of them are confused, misinformed, underinformed, you name it. We're all there, which caused people to be more tense, divided, and more opinionated than ever, which the past year and a half has been a struggle in that way. But I think we can sit here all day and name bad things that have happened, but I think we could also sit here all day and name like good things that have come out of this too. Because I know in my local body, we've had a lot of people, because of the frustration with culture and the inconsistencies of postmodernism, right? They're coming to know Christ because that's what seems reasonable. That's what's viable. And Christ is calling his people to himself. So it's cool to see that.
I think amidst brokenness, like, God is at work, and God uses brokenness in people's lives and in countries and even in churches to draw people to himself. And, when your world when your world falls apart, and all of these idols kind of, their mask get taken off and you see them for what they are, as worthless or temporary or whatever it may be. There's been a lot of fruit that's come out of this time as well, but no doubt it's been difficult. And I wonder, now certain studies are coming out too, but just how much these things have affected us, just mentally, emotionally, all these different things. Obviously, physically, for the people who have gotten sick and the people who have died and things like that. But like depression rates going up. Yeah, suicide rates, depression rates. Those were growing at an alarmingly fast pace even before COVID came out. The people in foster care and abuse victims and trafficking, all these other things. It's affected every aspect of our culture and lives, these decisions. And again, you can try to justify them or demonize them, but...
And not to be minimalistic about this, but we don't have time to get into it, but a presidential election took place in the middle of all this, and you have your typical election cycle, right? Conservatives demonizing liberals, liberals demonizing conservatives. And I think we did see a lot of people, and me being guilty of this at some points, elevating their politics above their faith, or looking at politics without that faith screen at all. And we saw this on both sides of the aisle, and it was a mess. And I don't think we need to beat that dead horse anymore. But even as COVID mandates were lifted, and I noticed this, but even as governors and localities said, hey, we don't have to deal with this anymore. People still warred over it, right? So some people were very strong-willed about their opinions on, say, masks and vaccines, both ways.
Yeah.
People for, people against it. So one of the perks with my job is I get to meet with a lot of pastors often, and it's really cool. So I've talked to some pastors over the past year where it was not atypical, meaning it was normal to see, say, 50% of your congregation leave your church because they had to wear a mask. On the other side of things, it wouldn't be abnormal to see 50% of your congregation leave because masks were not being required. So for pastors, this was like a lose-lose situation. The sheep, are rebelling over things that, like, I don't know if the mask thing really matters in an ultimate sense. It may not, but how are pastors supposed to be shepherding their sheep when their sheep keep biting each other over these kinds of things, right? It was a really discouraging time, I know, for many. But like I said, we can spend all day naming the negative things, but there are definitely positive things that came out of it too.
Yeah, and like that's a hard one too. I mean, I personally didn't see or experience, like, I'm sure there were ones out there, where they lost half their congregation. I definitely saw people leave because of things like that.
Yeah.
And like to some extent, like, for certain things, at the mask one, I have a harder time with, like, but not holding in-person worship services, like that. I sympathize maybe a little more, but I guess like other people would sympathize with the mask or no mask one if that's something they've held really strongly too. But I think part of the problem is like pastors really felt like they had to pick a side.
Yeah.
And like, which points to a fact that there's a division in the church. If you feel like you have to pick a side, now maybe that's a false narrative, and I think it is a lot of times, like, don't take the bait, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Don't feel like you have to pick a side. In one sense, like, I do think there is a time where, like, clearly you have to stand for truth and upon the word of God, and pick a side in that sense. So I'm not saying you don't ever have to pick a side, but certain things, like, I just wonder, like, why don't you? I'm not a pastor, so I'm sure there's pastors listening to this, like, you'd have no idea what it's like. I understand that, but like, just let the congregates wear a mask or don't wear a mask. Like, why? I just it puzzles me a little bit. Like, why do the people have to feel like they have to? And I guess
the problem that pastors are facing is that the pastor could say, hey, it's your choice all day, but you're still going to have the people in the congregation that say, pastor, you should have made a requirement. Why didn't you? I'm angry.
Yeah.
So then they bite more.
Right.
And it's kind of like that.
Yeah. And you even have like
dichotomy.
Evo jumping in there too, and other, whether it be really conservative Big Evo or really liberal Big Evo, so whatever association you're with is, or your denomination, I know places where, our denomination, you might have a session saying you need to do this, and a pastor saying like, no, so like, I don't know. It's tough. But you saw a lot of strawman arguments there too, and the weaker brother thing and all that.
Oh,
but,
all the time.
I don't envy pastors being in that position. But again, I just wonder, like, why wasn't it more of a individual thing?
Yeah. Well, and the hard part is despite the Delta variant and everything, it feels like we're more on the tail end of this pandemic, but the mania continues due to the echo chamber of social media and sensationalism, right? So you have people on the side of the argument that says COVID has a 99.97 survival rate, so I don't need to take any precautions. And then you have people on the other side that say COVID could kill someone's grandma. To not wear a mask is to be selfish. How dare you, murderer?
Right, literally Satan.
Yes, Satan. You have some people that say vaccines are a conspiracy surrounding government control, right? And you have some people that think that vaccines are the savior to all mankind. Again, people's opinions were colliding with facts. People's beliefs were colliding with their politics. People weren't even considering their beliefs when looking at politics. And this all had an impact on the local church. I think, and it's just tough.
It is. And I wonder, like, I think part of the problem, like, for me personally, like, and this is just where I come from, and I'm not an expert, that word gets tossed around too. I wonder how many people who are declared experts really are, but I'm on one side or the other, no matter what decision to make. But I think it's the heavy-handedness. Like for me, it's like, if you want to get a vaccine, that's great. That's your choice. If you don't want to get a vaccine, that's great. That's your choice. When you mandate it, and say you have to do this or you cannot do this, like, and what gets even more complicated is like we're seeing that in the church. And I don't know, I don't necessarily have an answer for this, but it's just a question I have. Like, is that even authority that God's given?
Right.
Officers of the church, because this isn't, this isn't a doctrinal issue, and this isn't, I don't know, it's like to say you have to wear a mask in this church or you cannot wear a mask in this church. Those types of things. Like, is that a decision? Is that just a practical decision that, people make other types of decisions like that? Or is this an overreach of their authority? Like, is this reaching outside the realm of authority that God has given them? I don't know. It's a question I've been thinking about.
Yeah. Well, if not,
I think like people, obviously with the government, that's an argument that's being had. Like, does the government have the authority to do this? I think one thing we're realizing is we've actually given up a lot of freedoms already, which has given grounds, for them to say, well, it's happened in the past. Look at this,
a little bit more.
Look at smallpox. Look at all this stuff, know. But yeah, I don't know. But within the church, that's a tough one. I don't know. And
if not a mandate, the virtue signaling, is just outrageous and it's obnoxious. So like you said, it's our culture almost, with how polarized even our politics are. It just seems like that's bleeding out into like, you must have an opinion on this subject or else you're wrong. If you don't agree with me, if you don't take a stance to affirm this, then you're evil or wrong or something like that. And it's tough because even on the things that are non-doctrinal or non-theological, you're almost forced to take a stance either way on a lot of things, on things you don't really want to think about. But all of this has spread via like social media, right? It's just been a hotbed for the spread of virtue signaling, straw man arguments, false information, sensationalism. It's just been a hotbed for all of that. And now, sure, let's look at Facebook, for example. There has been issues with like the overreach on Facebook and the quote unquote fact checkers out there.
Oh my gosh, it almost is like, I know, which maybe is a sign of pride within my own heart and simple tendencies. But when you get that now, like, you're kind of like, I thank you for that badge of honor. It's like, when back when Hillary called the Trump supporters like those basket of deplorables, and that became like a running thing where like that derogatory term then became for those people a badge of honor kind of things. Like with Facebook is like, you post something and they're like fact checking you or whatever. Or I do have to say though, I have seen a lot of Christians post a lot of really silly articles that have just been completely proven false. So like, there has been a lot of that too. It's just, we live in such a bizarre, where I know this is kind of off the topic. I was just thinking about this the other day, and I know people have like a lot of different opinions on Donald Trump and everything. But I was just thinking about the fact that, like Twitter deplatformed our president as he was still the president, whether you like it or not, but like, and even like, imagine you deplatforming Joe Biden, right? Who's the president, like still acting president. And then, so that wasn't allowed. And yet you had the Taliban on Twitter.
Yeah. Honestly though,
like, and whether or not your opinions on that, but like, how crazy is that? Like going back to like big tech, the Taliban and everything.
Have a spokesperson that is allowed to have Twitter, and we deplatformed the American president.
Going into dangerous waters, but do you ever like wonder what it would be like to like go on and like troll on their like Twitter feeds and stuff? Like, not don't do this, but just saying,
Jesus is Lord, Jesus is Lord. Oh man. But all of this being said, we've addressed a whole lot of just crazy things, and we're running real short on time. But so what do we do with this hot mess? Look, we're not this isn't an episode where we're claiming to like give you points to walk away with, but I guess these are just things that came to mind as I was writing this episode. Some are tongue in cheek, some are very serious. So just, I guess, take it as we go. But number one, instead of relying on social media or other horrible news outlets like CNN or Fox News for supposed truth, please run to the scriptures for the ultimate truth. Because when we fill our minds with the things of this world, we become more like the world, right? You're being shaped. No matter how you think about it, you are being shaped, right? So are you being formed and shaped into the mold of your favorite political spokesperson? Or are you being shaped and formed in the ways of Christ? And I think when we're on social media a lot, this can happen in subtle ways that you don't catch on to. So be aware of that.
And just how you're, acting on social media, like even outside like COVID stuff. But it's a good reminder, like then you can go to an extreme, right? I'm like where some people almost say Christians can't have an opinion and can't voice their opinions and can't, like that's not true. But the way you do it matters, And so being above reproach and speaking truth in love, I think like we need to have, educated opinions on these things and, understand coming at them from a biblical worldview and all this stuff. But how we go about doing that matters as well. Our character matters. And, we've all been guilty of it. It's easy to share that meme that, it's just so funny, but also is a little off color. And by off color, I mean probably not appropriate for a Christian to share and not really doing any good in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. Another point I have is instead of thinking that you are stronger when you're isolated, know that you are made for the community of the church. So that point is specifically to thinking through the social distancing and the church mandates and all that stuff. You are not stronger isolated. You are not more safe when you are apart from the body, right? You need the shepherd. You need the body of Christ to be there. And along with the church theme, instead of ripping your pastor apart about the church's COVID policies, mask, no mask, give them some grace as they're having to deal with a lot of biting sheep and a lot of wolves as well. So work with them on that, not against them. Obviously stand on the truth of God's word, but don't be the problem person when it comes to this in your church. Instead of putting your hope in a governing leader to achieve some end that you hope for, put your hope in Christ, who is the only one who is able to bring true peace and reconciliation. All this is not going to get any better. Come Lord Jesus, right? Maranatha. We sit here and we cry that. We proclaim that Jesus is coming again. So put your faith in that, not in the next president-elect or anything like that. Rather than fearing what a physical virus can do to your body or what a governor can do to your body, fear the one who can also destroy both the body and the soul.
And don't take that the wrong way. We're not saying don't be an idiot,
Yes, exactly. Don't be dumb.
Don't take someone who has COVID by their shoulders and demand them to cough into your face.
Have you done this, Travis?
No.
Oh, geez. But seriously though, like, don't be an idiot, but like, don't live in fear all of your life. Don't cower away. Don't think that you're safer in isolation.
Yeah, it's so sad to see people like crippled by fear, whether it be fear of the virus or fear of the government. And like, there's legitimate concerns there for sure. Like, and I think people tend to, going back to this kind of partisanship, they have an extreme fear of one or the other, perhaps. There's legitimate concerns there for both of them. But being ruled by fear is not the way we're called to live.
100%.
So can I just add another thing too, right? One, I've seen like another kind of pendulum show up here where people respond in opposite extremes when approaching these issues or other issues, and especially because a lot of this is like so politicized, is like you have people on one side who make their political party their religion or make Christianity their political party, right? Whether that be social justice or this whatever extreme nationalistic Christian, And then you also have those who divorce or try to divorce their political opinions from Christianity, where they have almost these lives that they kind of want to separate, and so they can be a Christian here and hold to this political party or whatever, and try to pretend that your Christian worldview doesn't affect your political choices. And you can't divorce that. You're supremely a Christian. And I see this argument, where you can be one or the other, and this can be a whole new, a bunch of issues where one is clearly unbiblical and wicked, and so, and then you have people kind of divorcing their Christian worldview or their Christian identity from their political identity. Obviously, your political identity is not, Christianity is not a political party, right? But your political choices should be influenced by your biblical worldview. So, don't fall into either extreme.
Amen to that. And I think to wrap us up tonight, instead of worrying about what tomorrow holds, whether it is the virus or whether it's the overreach of the government, hold tight to Christ, who has saved you from eternal death, right? To save you from the grips of hell and has brought you into eternal life. Hold fast to that hope. Christ will hold you fast. Nothing can destroy, nothing can separate us from the love of God through Christ Jesus. So hold tight in that hope. And, don't let what's going on today just bring you down to that pit of despair. We're made for so much more than that, right? We're made for so much more than fear and doubt and suffering. Although we might experience those things, Christ has overcome those things. So let's have faith in that. Well, Travis, this is a good discussion. There was a lot of there's a lot in this discussion.
So much that we left out, There's so much that we left out. Obviously not exhaustive. Obviously people have, and even what's interesting is you and I even have kind of differing opinions in things, right? I didn't get the vaccine and you did. And, we have friends that way. And what's interesting is some people that differing opinion would have led to the end of our friendship.
How sad.
Yeah.
How sad
that
is.
That again, there are things that you have to take a biblical stance on and everything, but it's sad to see something what should be individual decisions that
liberty.
Become the end all. So thankful we're still
crazy
friends,
thing.
man.
We're still friends, and we're still thankful for all of you who have listened to this podcast. So thanks for joining us today on the show. If you have any questions and you want to reach out to us, happyholyhour@gmail.com. We check it regularly. We also check our social medias regularly. So reach out to us. We'd be happy to connect with you. Remember to subscribe in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Leave a review so others can find the show. And if you're feeling led to donate financially to keep us running, that would be much appreciated. We don't have any ads on the show. We rely exclusively on the generosity of our listener base. So if that's something you're feeling called to, that would be awesome. And you can find all of that at our website at www.thehappyholyhour.org. And I think that's all we got for today.
Just
so
remember,
until next week.
2 weeks to flatten the curve.
18 months to flatten
2 years
the curve.
later.
Have a great week, everybody.